Here, there are a lot of things that we could talk about Matthew. We've talked about Matthew's emphasis on the law, and we've talked about how Matthew and the Pharisees and the scribes are they're doing the same thing in a different way. They're building up an oral Torah, a set of rules related to the Jewish law and how you should live according to them, but they're doing them and they're prescribing different actions. Okay, so for example, Jesus' actions aren't really about, say, purity, ritual purity, like what you might eat or what you might drink. Jesus' teachings are more about specific kinds of moral actions that you might undertake. Probably what we're seeing here in Matthew is sort of the painful break between the church and the synagogue. That what we have here is not Christians versus Jews. It's two kinds of Jews disagreeing with one another about what the future of Judaism is. Matthew's a very Jewish text in a lot of ways. And so Matthew's Jewish Jesus has a different way of living and teaching than the Pharisees and the scribes, who are also Jewish. And it's kind of like what we're peeking into is a family dispute. And we know family disputes can be quite bitter. Your hottest arguments are always with the people that you're closest to, right? Like denominational fights, stuff like that. You know, two Methodists or two Baptists might slug it out much more than a Methodist and a Baptist with each other. So that's kind of what we're seeing here. And so a lot of the language in Matthew that has taken on anti-Semitic interpretation through the years, been interpreted anti-Semitically, I should say, was certainly not meant in that way. It's like, you know, I'm a Methodist and I write about Methodist things all the time, like on my blog. And sometimes I say really harsh things about Methodists. But I can do that because I'm a Methodist, right? If Presbyterians start writing about Methodists, I might, get ticked off about that. But I can critique from within in a way that people can't from without. That's kind of what we're seeing here. Now, Matthew has what we would call an eschatological emphasis. The word eschaton in Greek means last. So these are sayings about the end of the current age. It's not the end of the world, but Matthew envisions a time when God is going to intervene very dramatically in the course of the events in the world, even more dramatically than with Jesus. God is going to intervene so dramatically that evil is going to be eradicated. Okay, and that is what we call Matthew's eschatological emphasis. Let's look at chapter 8. Verses 11 through 12. Jesus says, I tell you, many will come from east and west, and will eat with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the heirs of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Okay, what's it getting at here? I mean, Jesus is what this is getting at is a rejection of Jesus by most of Israel. Okay, and you can read this in Romans too. Romans, Paul is in agony over the fact that most of Israel has rejected Jesus. Most of the Jewish people have rejected Jesus. Matthew seems to be dealing with that as well, and saying that it's like a lament. He's saying he's crying over the fact that Jesus came to Israel, but most of Israel did not accept him. Let's look at 13:24. Okay, he put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? He answered, An enemy has done this. The slaves said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he replied, No, for in gathering the weeds you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time I will tell the reapers, Collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. Now then Jesus explains this later in 36. Then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples approached him, saying, Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field. He answered, The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom, and the weeds are the children of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears to hear listen. Okay, now this is a parable of judgment. That the children, the children of the kingdom are going to receive salvation, but the children of the evil one are going to receive judgment. Okay, another parable of judgment comes in chapter 22, the parable of the wedding banquet. So, he says that the kingdom of heaven is like a king that wants to hold a banquet for his son. So he sends slaves out to call those who are invited, but they won't come. So he sends the slaves out again, and the people who are invited make light of it. And again, they don't come. Some even seize his slaves. And so they seize and kill his slaves. So the king sends troops and destroys the murderers. He burns their city. Then the king says, The wedding is ready, but those invited are not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet. So the slaves do as they're told, and they gathered all whom they found, both good and bad, so the wedding hall was filled with guests. So 22:11, But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man who was not wearing a wedding robe, and he said to him, Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe? And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, Bind him hand and foot, and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called and few are chosen. Okay, so Matthew has a very strong notion of God's judgment. I mean, God's grace is there too. But you cannot go through Matthew without also getting a sense of God's judgment. And God's judgment is not going to be pleasant. Now, in some ways, you have to understand, Matthew is writing after the destruction of the temple in the year 70, okay, when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans at the end of the first Jewish revolt. And the temple in Jerusalem, which was the largest religious complex in the world at the time, was destroyed. You can still see the base of the temple today. If you go up on the Mount of Olives and look out over it, you can see how vast it was. And it was huge. I mean, it must have taken like elephants to tear this thing down. And I mean, the stones are massive. And this is just the base. I mean, this was a large structure that was built up. Of course, now they're not going to rebuild the temple, despite what people may say, because the Dome of the Rock is sitting on the temple. So unless you want to start World War III, you're not going to rebuild the temple. And and the temple was destroyed in the year 70. Matthew, you have to understand, sees the destruction of the temple as a judgment on Israel. Now, I'm not saying that that is true, okay? What I'm saying is that's how Matthew understands the destruction of the temple. He's writing about events that happened before the destruction of the temple, but he's writing after the destruction of the temple. And so some of these parables of judgment can be read in that light. Okay, destroying their city, sending the troops in, these kinds of things. These are probably references to the end of the first Jewish revolt. Okay, any questions about any of this? Yeah, Jim.
I noticed that 8:11 through 12, and then the 13:24 and following, 24 to 30, and then 36 to 50, and then 22:11 to 14 are all unique to Matthew.
There's a lot of unique Matthean material in this section. Yeah.
Just particular to him.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
A lot of these parables of judgment are unique to Matthew. Mm-hmm. It's his own. Matthew has a stronger eschatological emphasis, a stronger emphasis about the end of this age and God's judgment that's going to happen than any of the other Gospels. So in chapter 23, Jesus denounces the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, almost all this material is unique to Matthew in chapter 23. And he really takes on the scribes and the Pharisees here. He calls them whitewashed tombs and blind guides, you know. And if you ask yourself, why is this material in Matthew, but it's not in any other gospel? It's probably because Matthew is most directly involved in the dispute with the synagogue. Matthew is most directly involved with the break between the church, as it's becoming the church, and its predecessor tradition, Judaism. Okay, so in 23:37, after he finishes just really castigating the scribes and the Pharisees in 23 and 23:37, we get this lament. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often I have desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. Matthew probably understands this as a prediction about the destruction of the temple. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Okay, chapter 24, just like Mark 13, these are prophecies of Jesus about the end of the first Jewish revolt. When he says, beware that no one leads you astray, I'm in 24:5. For many will come in my name saying, I am the Messiah, and they will lead many astray, and you will hear of wars and rumors of war. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. Nation will rise up against nation, a kingdom against a kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All this is the beginning of the birth pangs. So Jesus is predicting, Jesus is prophesying about what's coming. N.T. Wright, who's a very, very good biblical scholar, talks about the fact that a huge chunk of Jesus' message was to tell Israel not to go down the path of violence it was headed down in the war against Rome. Don't do that. Don't go down that road. And in fact, Israel did go down that road, or a lot of Israel did go, not everyone, but a lot of Israel went down that road, and the result was catastrophic. I mean, Josephus, the first century Jewish historian who became a traitor and went over to he was a Jewish general, but he became a traitor and went over to the Roman side and helped the Romans in the conquering of Jerusalem. He writes about just the rivers of blood running through the city and just what a total massacre it was. I mean, the Romans were really mad because they'd been kept out of the city for months. They had to camp around. Jerusalem was a walled city. They had to camp around Jerusalem for months, and then they finally, got in through the wall. The Romans always did. I mean, it was just a matter of time. You can see the same thing at Masada. If you go down near the Dead Sea in Israel, Masada was a Herodian fortress. I mean, it's way, way, way up on top of they would call it a mountain. I wouldn't really call it a mountain, but it's way up there, and it's utterly inaccessible except by one road. They call it the Snake Road. Well, if all you have to defend is one little path, you can hold people off forever, really, as long as you've got supplies. And they had a lot of supplies up there. So the Romans actually, you can see the Roman encampments around from up on top of Masada, and they actually built, piece by piece, a ramp all the way up the side of Masada until they finally got up and killed everyone. Or Josephus says they all killed themselves. So, probably 24 is primarily about Jesus prophesying, this war is going to happen. Don't get caught up in this war. This isn't what God is calling you to. You need to get away from it. And these are going to be the signs of it. Okay? Now, moving on into the crucifixion story. We get the story of Jesus and Barabbas. And, Barabbas is in Mark 2. Anyone knows what Barabbas' name means? It means son of the Father in Aramaic. And, of course, we know that Jesus is the real son of the Father. So you have the fake son of the Father, who is a political insurrectionist, going free. And you have the real son of the Father being crucified as a political insurrectionist, even though he wasn't a political insurrectionist. So there's a lot of irony there. So, Pilate, it says, the Roman governor, doesn't want Jesus to be crucified because he doesn't think anything has gone wrong. I mean, he doesn't think Jesus has done anything wrong. But he says to the crowd, which of the two do you want me to release for you? Now I'm in 27:21. Which of the two do you want me to release for you, Jesus or Barabbas? And they said, Barabbas. Pilate said to them, then what should I do with Jesus who is called the Messiah? All of them said, let him be crucified. Now, these are the people, okay, who are in Jerusalem at this time. And he asked, why? What evil has he done? And they shout all the more, let him be crucified. So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. Then the people as a whole answered, and notice Matthew says the people as a whole. Matthew wants to indict Israel, okay, because the break between the church and the synagogue is painful. Okay, so the people as a whole, I mean, it can't be really the people as a whole because not all Jewish people were there, right? But the people who were there, how many people was this? 100, 200? They say, his blood be on us and on our children. Now, this has given rise in later Christian theology to a concept called the blood libel. The blood libel, which became really a source of controversy. If you remember Mel Gibson's movie The Passion of the Christ, this notion of the blood libel was resurfaced in relation to that movie. But the blood libel is the idea that Jews in perpetuity bear the blame for the death of Jesus. Okay, and that's not what Matthew has in mind here. Remember that for Matthew, it's hard to overstate the significance of the destruction of the temple in the year 70. And so his blood be on us and on our children is probably, Matthew probably means that literally. Like the next generation is gonna suffer because of what you have done here. And where the next generation is going to suffer is when they revolt against Rome and the Roman soldiers eventually conquer Jerusalem, slaughter the populace, and destroy the temple. We get more post-resurrection stories in Matthew. And really, the story of the crucifixion, and look at verse 52, chapter 27, verse 52. Let's back up to verse 50. Then Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last. Jesus dies. And what happens when Jesus dies? At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs were opened and the many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came up out of the tombs, entered into the holy city, and appeared to many. Now the centurion and those with him who were keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and what took place. They were terrified and said, "Truly this man was God's son." They also say that in Mark, but they say it without all the earthquake and people getting up out of the tomb stuff. So here, you can, kind of see why they would say that. And then finally, in Matthew 28, we get what is called the Great Commission. And this is really what Jesus leaves his disciples with. So 28:18, Jesus said, "All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." And the word for nations also means Gentiles in Greek. Okay, so make disciples beyond Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, but beyond Jerusalem. In Israel, but beyond Israel. Make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I had commanded you. So you baptize them, and then you teach them to obey what Jesus taught. That's the commission. You make disciples of the Gentiles. You baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And you teach them to obey everything Jesus commanded them. And then he says, and remember, I am with you always till the end of the age. And that's it. That is Matthew.